Okay, let's move on to Objective 9. We're looking here at directional terms. So we are describing things in the body in relation to each other. And as you learn the bones of the body, the major organs of the body, you ought to be able to describe them using directional terms. Anytime we use a directional term, we are referring to someone standing in anatomical position. So look at our naked lady on the left, our skeleton man on the upper corner here. Both are standing in anatomical position. It becomes very important as we're describing parts of the body that we're referring to anatomical position. You will use these directional terms all of the time when you're out there working in the healthcare field. A physician would refer to this in discussing his patient, where something is in the patient, a surgeon, a radiologist, whatever. We will use directional terms. So very important that you become familiar with these. First two are fairly easy, superior and inferior. Look at the skeleton man. The top of him is superior towards the head, inferior towards the bottom. Sometimes we say towards the caudal end or the tail end. Superior, inferior. So you could say that the heart is superior to the intestines, or the intestines are inferior to the heart. The next two terms are medial and lateral. Medial, again, look at the top of the skeleton man. Medial is towards the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. Now this becomes important. Look at the lower forearm of this man. The bone that is there towards the thumb is the radius. Okay, the smaller bone there on the medial side towards the midline is the ulna. So we can say the ulna is medial to the radius. It's closer to the midline. Or the radius is lateral to the ulna. Now this becomes important that this person you're referring to is an anatomical position, because what if his arm was facing the other direction? That would no longer, those directional terms would no longer hold true. So always an anatomical position. Next two terms, proximal and distal, you may not be familiar with. These are usually used in referring to the extremities. Proximal would mean closer to the point of attachment of that extremity. Distal, think of distant, further away from the point of attachment. So again, looking at our skeleton man, the big bone in the upper arm is the humerus bone. If we were referring to that in relation to the radius, the bone there coming up in the forearm closer to the thumb, okay, we would say the humerus is proximal to the radius, meaning the humerus is closer to the point of attachment of that limb. The radius would be distal to the humerus. It's further away from the point of attachment. So practice using those as you learn the bones and parts of the body. Anterior and posterior. Anterior is towards the front, posterior towards the back. Not too hard on those. Ventral and dorsal are very similar. Ventral means the front side or the ventral side of the body. Dorsal, the back side. I remember dorsal from a shark because they have a big dorsal fin that sits on their back. So any of you that watch Shark World and freak yourself out for a week and never want to get in the ocean again, that dorsal fin is the big fin you see on their back, so it's back side. Okay, last two, ipsilateral and contralateral. Ipsilateral is the same side of the body. Look at our naked woman. Her right arm and her right leg are ipsilateral to each other. They're on the same side of the body. When she's turning and we see the back side, her right arm and her left leg are contralateral to each other. They're on the opposite sides of the body, and that's all those two terms mean. We're going to introduce a couple of new terms here. We're looking at a transverse horizontal section of the thoracic cavity. And you can see, probably you can identify the lungs there, part of the heart that we've sliced that through in a section. So you can see these terms, some new terms being used here, superficial and deep being two that we will use. Superficial is closer to the body surface. On the lower end here you can see the vertebrae. On the upper side you can see the sternum or the breastbone. Okay, those are superficial. They're closer to to the surface of the body. Deep to that, we've got the esophagus, the trachea, the valves of the heart are all deep to those bones. They're deeper within the body. Okay, two more terms that we're introducing here that we will use throughout this course are parietal and visceral. Our body organs are lined by a membrane, or we call it a serous membrane. For now, know that it has two walls and some fluid in between. You can see the two walls pointing to the arrows that say visceral and parietal, and the stuff inside would be the fluid. This helps with things like our lungs, so that every time we breathe, they're cushioned and it doesn't hurt every time we breathe and we go, I wish I could take a break from breathing for a while. It helps. Okay, so we've got this fluid in there protecting our lungs. We have a membrane lining our heart, membranes lining our abdominal organs, etc. So the lining that lays on the organ itself is called the visceral lining, the visceral layer. Often our abdominal organs are referred to as the viscera, meaning they're on that, a lot of them on the front side of the body, the viscera. So that visceral lining then is the lining that lies on the organ itself. The parietal lining is the one further away. So you can see that that is the superficial lining, the one further away from the visceral, and in between there is fluid. Become familiar with those terms because, again, we will use those throughout both courses. Okay, switching gears to Objective 10. I referred to taking a plane or a sample when we were looking at the last picture back here, where I said this was a transverse or horizontal section. I'm going to describe those planes here now through this. This poor lady reminds me of some naked lady that a magician got the better of. Okay, so he sliced her up every which way. She kind of is still smiling, but these are taking planes of the body. Now, when would it be important to know what type of plane we're looking at? Well, look back at this picture. It's important to know what slice of the body we've taken here so we can identify organs, identify what we're looking at. Those of you that are going into rad tech, you will all the time need to be knowing what type of plane or what type of x-ray you're taking of the body. Again, a pathologist looking at gross anatomy would need to know what type of plane or body section he was looking at, or he or she, not to be sexist. You should be watching in your first lab an autopsy movie, which is awesome. You can go home and brag to everyone that you saw a movie of an autopsy. They will take different sections of the brain, whatever they're slicing up here, and pay attention when they describe the plane that they're taking. Okay, the first plane we're going to describe is a sagittal plane. This divides the body into right and left halves. If it divides the body into equal halves, meaning it goes right down the center of the body, as you can see in this woman, it's called a mid-sagittal plane, so into two equal halves of the body. Parasagittal means around the midline, so it would be parallel to that plane, but we wouldn't have equal halves. Look at the parasagittal plane on this woman. You can see her right half would have more than the left half, so that's a parasagittal plane. Transverse or horizontal is parallel to the floor. We're dividing the body into upper and lower portions. By the way, you should know when we give you two names for these planes, be familiar with both names. The last section is a frontal or coronal plane, and you can see we're dividing the body into anterior and posterior sections. That's called a frontal or a coronal plane. Now, don't get freaked out for your first test. We are not going to make you identify a gross anatomy or a picture and say what type of plane this is, but you should be familiar with this woman and the planes identified here, and that shouldn't be too difficult. So here's some sections, and look how different they look from the brain depending on what section we're taking here. The first is a mid-sagittal plane. We've divided the brain right down the midline into equal right and left halves. The second one is a frontal or coronal plane, so we're dividing the brain into anterior and posterior sections. And the last is transverse or horizontal, where we're dividing the brain into superior and inferior sections. So you can just, without even having studied the brain or understanding the parts of the brain, you can look here and just see how different, because we're taking different sections of the brain, and we can identify different things depending on the section we've taken. Here we are in imaging. So all of you rad tech wannabes, these are some of the different planes that you would be asked. We would like a sagittal plane of the brain, or a coronal, or a transverse plane of the brain, and you can see how they look different. Here we've got probably some radioactive material giving us that pretty color in there where the brain is uptaking certain radioactive material. Okay, now this is an awesome YouTube clip. What I found is you can find anything you want on YouTube, and it's awesome. This is someone that took sections of their brain and put it to music, and it's just fun watching the brain as it's sliced all the way through at different sections, and you can see the different types of sections and how it's sliced. So have fun watching this. Okay, it's been fun talking with you all, and I'll be back on a future lecture, but good luck with Unit 1, and it's been a pleasure. Thanks.